how'd he pick up them logs that stayed on there? And his axe cut every one of them joints right there. And so he built himself a cabin on one side, and that was called a pen. It was just a little bitty house for the first year. If he was going to survive, he had to come in the spring, get his cabin up, had to plant some crops where the trees, he cut them down and left some open ground, and he'd plant some crops to survive a winter. So given that he had a place and one little pen is what he had. Now, it could be the next year, or it could be 2 years later if he got a few more nails, and nails were most important because you couldn't put, you know, a roof on it, stay there without something to hold it. So he'd peg his walls together, and if you look at that giant peg around that log, or see that peg hole up in the top of that log right there? See them two pegs?
Yeah.
That's what held that log down on the top. Now, if you don't remove those pegs in that cap log first, it ain't coming apart. But he had to build the first cabin, and then the following years, he built a second one. After he put a second one up, then he could join them together and cover the middle. And the middle was where he could work and find shelter, and he'd bring his crops in there, and he'd have a place out of the rain, and he probably didn't enclose it till many years later. Now I see across the bottom, he put another log, and that was another sill. So that he built a sill so that he could then put a wall up and that he could enclose the dog trot. So that's where the dogs stayed, unless it was a real cold night, and he had a chimney or fireplace on either end. So he had to stoke his fire in the wintertime, and he had to cook with it in the summer. So he made himself a cooking type of fireplace. He had a few things to cook in, and he had some jars and stuff to store stuff in. But if you're going to save any meat, as soon as you kill it, you got to cut it in little strips and dry it out. So if you got salt, you can salt it, but if you don't have salt, you got to jerk it. So that means that meat won't ruin or rot if it's been dried out. So then the flies won't attack it, stuff like that. So you dry your meat and dry your fish too, because he'd catch fish. And that's why he put his house here, because it was near water. You got to have water, and you got to have it up out of the floodplain so you don't get flooded. He probably had that ditch there. Now, I would say that in previous years, it probably had a spring house here, because it looked like maybe a spring flowed out of this little side creek. So that was the early life, and I guarantee it was hard till his wife came and maybe brought what children and maybe some more stuff. He may have gone back to get her. Or she may have traveled with somebody else that was coming to the new territory. So it was really hard. And we'll look at these logs and how he carved each one of the joints. And he took mud out of the creek and he stuffed it between the logs to chink them. Chinking is what you had to cover in the holes. Then in later years, he wanted to stop all the air because the chinking had shrink back from those logs, let air in. So quite often that they put newspaper or anything else they could on the inside walls and stop the air from flowing in. And then it was dark because you didn't have windows, you just had shutters. So there was still Indians around here, and they'd come in and peer in your house, and that, they weren't a real threat, but they were still hungry and they were looking, for anything they could get. So they still had Indians all along here until the Indians were removed later in the Trail of Tears. A lot of them left, but a lot of them stayed, and that they were part of the neighborhood then, man's wife or maybe this woman's husband.